El Mayo, Mexico's most powerful drug trafficker of all time, pleads guilty to charges in a Brooklyn courtroom. Is the Iranian government hiring Australian gangsters to target Jewish buildings? All of that and much more in this week's edition of Organized Crime News Weekly. Welcome back to Organized Crime News Weekly. This is the weekly show where we discuss the goings-on in the global criminal underworld. Before I start, I just want to remind everyone to please like, share, and subscribe so we can help grow this channel. Also, please make sure to support my channel. You can do that by just contributing $2.99 a month. Any contribution is greatly appreciated, and it helps me to continue making these videos. At the end of each video, I will give a shout out to each individual who contributes. On August 26th, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese announced that Iranian ambassador to Australia Ahmad Sadeghi was being expelled from the country due to allegations made by the Australian Security Intelligence Organization regarding two separate attacks against Jewish establishments in Australia that are said to have been masterminded by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and carried out by members of criminal organizations. At 2:30 in the morning on October 20th, 2024, two individuals broke into Lewis's Continental Kitchen, a kosher restaurant in Sydney, where they proceeded to pour gasoline across the premises before setting it ablaze. More than $1 million in damage was caused to the restaurant, and nearby residents were forced to evacuate. 4 individuals have since been arrested for carrying out the attack on Lewis's, and it has been determined that they were hired to carry out this arson by Saeed Musawi, a former chapter president for the Nomads Outlaw Motorcycle Club. Musawi is alleged to have used the encrypted messaging app Signal to communicate with the perpetrators of the arson attack, where he went under the username James Bond. He was arrested on January 10th of this year and is currently out on bail awaiting trial for orchestrating the attack on Lewis's, as well as for the arson attack on a brewery that occurred a couple days prior in what was a case of mistaken identity, as the perpetrators mistook the brewery for being Lewis's. The second of these attacks that has been highlighted by the Australian government for wanting to expel the Iranian ambassador pertains to an attack that occurred in the early morning hours of December 6, 2024, when 3 masked men firebombed the Adass Israel Synagogue in Melbourne, causing extensive damage to the building, with part of the roof collapsing, as well as one member of the synagogue suffering minor injuries to his hands. 2 men by the names of Yunus Ali Yunus and Giovanni Lalu have since been arrested and charged for carrying out this attack. It is believed by Australian authorities that these 2 were ordered to carry out the attacks by Kazim Kaz Hamad, a powerful crime boss who controls a large chunk of the illicit tobacco market in the Australian state of Victoria. Hamad has been partly responsible for the wave of violence that has plagued the Melbourne underworld for the past couple of years, as he fights off rivals for control of the city's illicit tobacco trade, which some say is even more profitable for these criminals than trafficking in narcotics. This war has seen numerous murders and firebombings carried out against tobacco shops across Melbourne, with legitimate tobacco shops even being targeted for refusing to sell the illicit tobacco that these criminal groups offer, which is much cheaper due to the high taxes placed on tobacco products in Australia. Hamad is not currently in Australia, as he was deported to Iraq in 2023 after serving an 8-year prison sentence for drug trafficking. However, despite being on the other side of the world, Hamad has managed to maintain his control over the Victorian underworld. He is believed to have carried out the attack on the Adass Synagogue on the orders of the IRGC in order to curry favor with them. But here's another example of the Iranian regime allegedly hiring criminals and organized crime figures to carry out attacks against their perceived enemies, primarily Jews. And this seems to have been a huge problem plaguing Australia for the past year. It's not just these 2 incidents, but there's been many other incidents in the past couple of years of fire bombings against Jewish establishments. Obviously, this also comes as Israel carries out its brutal campaign in Gaza. The Australian authorities even stated that some of this info came directly from Israel, which to me makes it more questionable due to Israel wanting to obviously push a certain agenda. It's funny that they criticize firebombings against synagogues and restaurants when they're doing much worse over in Gaza. The Australian government has apparently been so disturbed by these events that they are even threatening to not recognize a Palestinian state, which is unfortunate. While criminal groups may be aiding in these attacks of Jewish establishments, I think it's kind of annoying how Israel always plays the victim in these situations. Musawa, the person accused of orchestrating the first attack I talked about, he's set to face trial in October. It remains to be seen if Kazem Hamad is going to be extradited back to Australia to face charges. I imagine it's not too easy to extradite someone back from Iraq, but we shall see what the future holds for Hamad, who is currently one of Australia's most notorious organized crime figures, and we shall see if there are any more attacks leveled against Jewish establishments in Australia. At least 18 people were killed and more than 60 injured in two separate attacks that occurred in Colombia on August 21st that point to armed groups heavily involved in cocaine trafficking. That morning, a Black Hawk helicopter carrying police officers was carrying out an operation to destroy coca crops when it was shot down by an explosives-laden drone in the city of Amalfa, located in the Colombian department of Antioquia. 12 police officers were killed in the attack. Later that day, a truck equipped with mortar shells and cylinder bombs containing ammonium nitrate was blown up in front of a military aviation school in Cali, Colombia's third most populated city, killing 6 people and injuring dozens. The explosion caused several buildings in the area to be evacuated, along with street closures and traffic restrictions issued by the mayor's office. Cali Mayor Alejandro Eder then declared a state of emergency in the city and announced a temporary ban on large trucks in the city. 2 individuals have since been arrested for their possible roles in the attacks. These attacks have since been attributed to a dissident faction of the former Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, the FARC, or Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia in English. For over 60 years, the FARC waged a civil war against the Colombian state that saw almost 500,000 killed during that time. To finance their war against the state, the group engaged in activities such as the extortion of small businesses in areas they controlled, as well as kidnapping for ransom. As the Colombian cocaine trade blew up in the 1980s, the FARC started to tax cocaine laboratories operating in areas they controlled. In 2016, the FARC finally reached an agreement with the Colombian government and agreed to demobilize and reincorporate into civilian life. However, despite the disbandment of the FARC, many of its former members set up their own armed guerrilla groups. These numerous new groups, rather than adhering to any sort of leftist ideology, such as what the FARC adhered to, they became solely focused on criminal activities and became much more directly involved in the cocaine trade. The group that has been singled out by prominent politicians, such as Colombian President Gustavo Petro, as being responsible for both of these attacks is the Estado Mayor Central, the EMC, or Central General Staff in English, a federation of dissident factions of the FARC that refused to participate in the 2016 peace talks between the FARC and the Colombian government. Since its formation in 2016, the EMC has spread all across Colombia and even into Venezuela and has become a key supplier of cocaine for Brazilian and Mexican cartels. In addition to cocaine trafficking, it engages in other criminal activities such as extortion and illegal mining. Since 2022, the EMC has been led by Nestor Gregorio Vera Fernandez, also known as Ivan Mordisco. The group's main rival for control over criminal activities across Colombia is the Ejército de Liberación Nacional, ELN, or National Liberation Army, a far-left insurgency group that is said to be supported by the Venezuelan government. The EMC is said to have joined up with Clan del Golfo, arguably the largest cocaine trafficking organization in Colombia that has its roots in the right-wing paramilitaries of Colombia's past, and they both have teamed up to combat the ELN. The 2 attacks this past week come after multiple attacks that occurred in the previous 2 months attributed to the EMC, in which over a dozen people were killed in the Colombian department of Valle de Cauca. Since the FARC demobilized in 2016, there has been a great uptick in violence between Colombian paramilitary groups, and it's especially ratcheted up this past year as these groups look to control the various criminal economies across all of Colombia, such as cocaine trafficking and illegal mining. The Colombian government, showing that at times while they're willing to negotiate with these groups, also has been carrying out various bombing campaigns against them this past year, as well as destroying many of their cocaine laboratories. To me, it seems at this point that the paramilitary groups are too powerful to completely eradicate, and no matter how hard the Colombian government tries to neutralize them, they carry on. And it seems like no matter how many peace agreements the Colombian government makes with these groups, they always fall apart. It just seems like an endless cycle. But this has been the state of Colombian cocaine trafficking and guerrilla warfare for decades now, and it shows no signs of ending. On August 25th, in a federal courthouse in Brooklyn, New York, Ismael Zambada Garcia, better known as El Mayo, pleaded guilty to charges of leading a continuing criminal enterprise from 1989 to 2024, as well as RICO conspiracy, RICO being the Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act that was created in the 1980s to go after groups like the Italian Cosa Nostra. But he pleaded guilty to RICO conspiracy, where he was found guilty of participating in an organization that engaged in criminal activities such as drug trafficking, murder, money laundering, and kidnapping from the years 2000 to 2012. El Mayo confessed to all of these charges, as well as agreeing to forfeit $15 billion in assets to the U.S. government at his sentencing, which I don't know how they would even find $15 billion in assets, especially when they're obviously going to be hidden under various people's names. But I guess we'll see how that works out. El Mayo's guilty plea comes after much speculation that he would confess in order to avoid a harsher sentence, as just until last month, it was speculated that U.S. prosecutors would seek the death penalty for him. El Mayo is said to have started out in the drug trade at the age of 19 back in 1969 when he became involved in trafficking marijuana. He quickly built up close ties to powerful Mexican drug traffickers, such as the Carrillo Fuentes family of Juarez, who at that time operated under the umbrella of the Guadalajara cartel under Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo. After Felix Gallardo was arrested in 1989, the Guadalajara cartel split up into multiple factions across Mexico, and this is when El Mayo, along with Joaquin El Chapo Guzman and others, formed the Sinaloa cartel. Under the leadership of El Mayo and El Chapo, the Sinaloa cartel, over the next 2 decades, became the most powerful Mexican cartel and arguably one of, if not the most powerful and influential drug trafficking organizations in the world, using innovative methods to traffic drugs across the U.S.-Mexico border, such as cocaine, heroin, marijuana, methamphetamines, and eventually fentanyl. They expanded the cartel's influence all across the world to South America, Europe, Asia, Australia, and Africa, so basically every continent except for Antarctica. The Sinaloa cartel's success owes greatly to their ability to compromise the highest levels of the Mexican government. El Mayo's son, Vicente Zambada Niebla, who ultimately became a government witness, testified at El Chapo's trial in 2019 that El Mayo was paying as much as $1 million a month in bribes to many high-level Mexican politicians. And I also want to point out at this moment that despite El Chapo being the one that got all the attention from the press as being the ultimate boss of the Sinaloa cartel, it can be argued that El Mayo held greater power and more respect in the Mexican cartel landscape, and that El Chapo, while he was very powerful in his own right, could be compared to being sort of a figurehead of the Sinaloa cartel, while it appears that El Mayo was probably the true brains behind the cartel for all these years. And it seemed like El Mayo used this to his advantage to stay out of the limelight, and he was happy for El Chapo to take all the attention away from him. And this caused El Chapo to be targeted much more heavily by Mexican and U.S. law enforcement, with him being arrested multiple times and incarcerated. While for the 50-plus years El Mayo operated, he was never once arrested until last year. After El Chapo was finally captured in 2016 and ultimately extradited to the U.S., his faction was taken over by his sons, dubbed the Los Chapitos, who often didn't see eye to eye with El Mayo, and this would ultimately lead to El Mayo's downfall. On July 25th, 2024, El Mayo went to what he thought was a meeting in Culiacan, along with the Chapitos, to settle a dispute between Sinaloa Governor Ruben Roca Moya and another Sinaloan politician. The meeting, however, turned out to be a setup, and El Mayo was kidnapped by the Chapitos gunmen and placed on a private jet destined for the United States, along with Joaquin Guzman Lopez, one of the 4 Chapitos, and he is said to have orchestrated El Mayo's kidnapping as a bargaining chip in order for his brother Ovidio Guzman to receive a lighter sentence. The plane landed at a private airfield near El Paso, Texas, and both Mayo and Joaquin Guzman were promptly arrested and taken into custody before El Mayo was ultimately extradited to Brooklyn, where he initially pleaded not guilty. He is scheduled to be sentenced on January 13th, 2026, and faces a mandatory minimum of life imprisonment and a maximum sentence of 2 life sentences. So it's pretty much given at this point that he's going to spend the rest of his life in prison, as he is already 75 years old, and there's no way he's going to be able to get some sort of parole anytime soon, especially if he has potentially 2 life sentences. The U.S. government obviously points to this as a great victory for them. The fact that they captured Mexico's most powerful and elusive cartel boss, who had never even once set foot in a jail cell until just last year when he was arrested. To me, this victory parade seems rather short-sighted. Yes, El Mayo was very powerful and influential, but he was already 75 years old, and he was going to die sooner rather than later. And since his arrest last year, his son, Ismael Zambada Zakairos, better known as Maito Flaco, has taken over his faction of the Sinaloa cartel and is leading it in its war against the Los Chapitos faction of the Sinaloa cartel. This war has been going on since September of last year. It was started by El Mayo's son due to the betrayal of Los Chapitos when they surrendered his father to U.S. authorities. And in the almost 1 year that this war has been going on, already 2,000 people have been murdered, with many more having disappeared, and it shows no signs of slowing down. So it seems to me that the capture of El Mayo has only further destabilized the Mexican cartel landscape. But obviously, U.S. politicians and law enforcement are all about advancing their careers, so they don't really care about that. They just care that they caught a very notorious criminal, and they fail to see that other individuals are already rising up to replace El Mayo, such as his son. And even though the Sinaloa cartel increasingly continues to disintegrate, there's other cartels like the Jalisco New Generation cartel that are rapidly rising in power. And this is a trend that never ends, as these criminal groups are always replaced by sometimes even more powerful and violent groups. To me, this is the biggest flaw of the ridiculous war on drugs, and that they're so short-sighted that when they arrest a big kingpin like El Mayo, they'll celebrate it even though the problem never ends. The drugs never stop flowing north of the border. And the cartels increasingly come to control large swaths of Mexico in place of the Mexican state. But obviously the capture of El Mayo and his conviction is a big deal. I don't want to make light of that, but I just want to point out that arresting and prosecuting El Mayo will change nothing, as the drug world was already moving on from him at the time of his capture, and the kingpins that are replacing him now will someday be arrested, and the process will just keep repeating itself. All right, that's going to do it for this week's edition of Organized Crime News Weekly. Thank you so much for tuning in. Special thanks to Julia Gates 4573 and the Green Beret Boxer 34 for contributing to this channel. I'll be back next week to report on more stories concerning the global criminal underworld. Thank you so much for tuning in.